everyone. This is Fahad Malaika coming to you from Washington, D.C. with the 10th edition of the NESA Alumni Virtual Interview Series. Today, we are honored to be joined by Professor Steven Blockmans, who is the Director of Research, Head of EU Foreign Policy, and Head of Institutional Affairs at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, based in Brussels. He is also a professor of EU External Relations Law and Governance at the University of Amsterdam. For more than 20 years, he has combined his academic work with contract research carried out for EU and national donors, as well as consultancy activities and training for professionals. Stephen and I first met around 2013 with activities associated with the NESA Center Strategic Studies Network, and we are really lucky and proud to count Stephen among our alumni ranks. To those watching from home, make sure you also check out the website of CEPS, which is consistently rated as one of the top think tanks in Europe and the world at the Global Go-To Think Tank Index report that is out of the University of Pennsylvania. So today, we want to talk about the prospects and challenges of U.S.-EU relations under a new Biden presidency. It's safe to say that, on the whole, U.S.-EU relations were strained under the Trump administration. Joe Biden's victory has been hailed by some foreign policy analysts as an inevitable return to multilateralism under a new administration that will work hard to repair strained transatlantic relations once he takes office. On the other hand, some analysts are more cautious and have argued that U.S.-EU relations are forever altered following the Trump administration. So that brings me to my first question for you, Stephen, and we will start from the broad and get into more specifics. How would you describe or characterize the current U.S.-EU relationship? Over to you.
Well, thanks, Fahad, and thank you very much for those warm, welcoming words. It's great to be back with NESA, albeit virtually, and to do this interview with you. Well, to answer your question, I think the EU-US relationship can be characterized as damaged as a result of Donald Trump's unabashed unilateralism. It has hurt transatlantic relations. He's called the European Union a foe, worse than China, just smaller, his quote, not mine. And he's celebrated Brexit. He has encouraged other member states to leave the bloc. He has bullied democratic leaders such as Angela Merkel, embraced autocrats such as Viktor Orban. And this is delayed or derailed some of the activities, of the EU institutions in trying to reestablish the rule of law in increasingly autocratically led EU member states. Of course, on the multilateral agenda, Trump, with his retreat from the Paris Climate Deal, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Agreement, the WHO, as well as his attacks on the WTO, they've rocked Europeans' belief that they share common ground with their strategic ally, their most important ally in the world. And in fact, Trump has been disdainful of European priorities in this area, from climate change to efforts to improve global health, human rights, development assistance. And Europeans have been at the short end of the stick as far as U.S. Treasury Department's use of extraterritorial sanctions are concerned, over the withdrawal of the U.S. From the Iran nuclear deal. And so, as a result, U.S. relations with the European Union have become largely dysfunctional in recent months, if not years. And this at a time of unprecedented global health, economic, and security challenges, which demand, of course, a robust transatlantic leadership. To be sure, this disarray is not just due to Trump. After more than a decade of crisis management on the European side, starting with the Euro debt crisis and then rolling over into the migration refugee crisis, of course, the Arab Spring and the war in Syria, Libya, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. The EU as you know, seems likely to fall apart has come together at many of these stages, including during the COVID-19 pandemic. But it should not be forgotten that the EU has managed to, you know, to rally around the flag. At least member states have been able to reach a political agreement on what many analysts have said is a historic recovery package, a 7-year budget. So in this sense, you know, it could widen perhaps the perception, at least under the still, you know, the presidency of Trump, that the transatlantic relationship has frayed as a result of, you know, opposing dynamics on either side of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Steven. So what are your overall thoughts on the constructive opportunities for US and EU relations under a new Biden administration? Do you expect the new Biden administration to be successful in reviving transatlantic ties? Over to you.
Well, a lot depends, of course, on how quickly Joe Biden and his team will hit the ground running as far as international affairs are concerned. I mean, the expectations here on this side of the Atlantic are, of course, that there are now 4 years to revive an alliance of democracies, and Biden himself has called for such an alliance in order to face up, you know, to authoritarian powers and closed economies, you know, the China, Russia, increasingly Turkeys of this world, that exploit, you know, the openness of both the American and the European societies, and shape, in a way, you know, the ability for the transatlantic partners to shape those parts of multilateralism that still serve their joint interests. And Biden is at least known in Europe as a firm transatlanticist, has been pro-Europe. In fact, he's on record of having said that Europe is the cornerstone of our US's engagement with the world, the catalyst for global cooperation. So with that type of passion, you know, for transatlanticism, the expectations here are very high. That Biden's first instinct, you know, would be to turn to the European partners as, you know, America's indispensable ally of first resort when it comes to addressing international challenges. But by the same token, I think there's a keen awareness here that because of, you know, the unenviable confluence of crises at home, the president-elect will have to deal with those first. The ongoing pandemic, of course, deep social and political tensions, the continued recession, and also the fact that he will have to contend, Biden that is, with a much stronger radical conservative opposition than Barack Obama ever did. So those in Europe who think that America's foreign policy will be reset to the status quo ante, I think deluding themselves. I think Biden's policy agenda, however ambitious it is now being proclaimed before it takes office on the 20th of January, is likely in its implementation at least to be slowed down by those domestic challenges. So at the same time, I think Europeans should welcome the fact that Biden addresses those first, strengthens, shores up basically America's resolve before it ventures out into the world.
Thank you, Steven. So on the flip side, how would you advise EU partners to adjust their approach to the new Biden administration to ensure the relationship going forward is more constructive? Over to you.
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's not a lot of contemplation happening on the European side. I mean, the danger is, of course, that most European leaders now content themselves with a Biden victory and lean back and relax, whereas there's a lot of homework to be done on the European side to revive the transatlantic relationship. But here, I think again, Europe's leaders should not kid themselves into believing that there will be a return to the status quo ante. I mean, for all the changes that have been happening in the world and in America itself, it's likely that Biden will want to reinvent a transatlantic relationship rather than simply restore it. I also think that given the domestic challenges that he will have to confront, the rallying cry of America First is in fact here to stay, even if, cannot sugarcoat it in, different ways, which is important. I mean, the mood music is important, but the fact that Biden has vowed to prioritize investment in US green energy, infrastructure, rather than any new trade deals, especially the revival of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the EU, and the fact that he's called for expanded Buy America provisions in federal procurement, I mean, these are thorns in the side of European trade negotiators, of course. They've long been, and they risk continuing to be. Now, on the European side, there is therefore, first and foremost, a need for a reality check as to what to expect from Biden administration. And secondly, to work hard for it itself. I mean, this is not going to be business as usual. And the European Union will have to, Europe and its collection of member states, will have to up their own game. Here, last week, at least in the first week of December, I believe it was, the European Commission and the High Representative of Foreign Affairs, they published a joint communication, which is an 11-page paper, essentially appealing to the Biden administration, to seize this, this unique opportunity that now presents itself to shore up the transatlantic relationship. And here, a lot is riding, I think, on ironing out the creases over, traditional transatlantic bugbears, especially having to do with the regulation of big tech. There's a Digital Services Act and a Digital Market Access Act, which are being proposed by the European Commission, which will try and curb some of the power of the big American tech companies. But I think, overcoming those differences will be key for the transatlantic partners to revive a multilateral agenda, which ultimately is based on their own compromise between economic interests and values in the end, the values of free speech and assembly, of course, which is under threat in so many other parts of the world. So I think if both economies and their administrations are able to crack that nut around rules of the game in the cybersphere and in digital industries, I think a lot of ground will have been made in order, or prepared at least, for a more constructive agenda and this idea of an alliance of democracies that shapes up parts of the multilateral system that have served them so well in the post-World War II era.
Thank you. So turning now to the NESA region, what specific role can Europe, partnering with the Biden administration, play to reduce tensions with Iran and potentially get back to a JCPOA plus negotiation? Over to you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, I mean, the European Union, through the High Representative of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, has effectively led, the supervisory committee of the JCPOA, and has kept the European partners on board despite the withdrawal of the US by President Trump. And so Europeans have never made a secret that it's in their collective interest, in the world's interest, to keep everyone wedded to the JCPOA. And they've tried at least to withstand some of the pressure that the Treasury Department had piled upon European companies for trading with Iran, and so there the resistance on against the extraterritorial long arm of the U.S. Treasury Department is likely to be that arm is likely to be weakened under Biden. He has said, of course, that he's willing to send a signal of rejoining the JCPOA, which I think is important to do at a first stage, and then to work with European allies on perhaps the conditions for the US to rejoin. And I think there's a lot of common ground actually on issues of the international or the regional mischief that Iran has caused in the wider Middle East. The fight through its proxies is a common bone of contention, transatlantically speaking, with the Iranians, and likely to be feeding into any renegotiated settlement that brings the US on board. So I think the Biden administration will find certainly a helping hand on the European side. It will come certainly at the cost of lessening the extraterritorial jurisdiction, and in fighting for indeed the revival of the JCPOA in its full glory, and stem the search of the Iranians for a nuclear weapon.
Thank you. So staying with the NESA region, there are numerous tensions and conflicts in the southern and eastern portions of the Mediterranean region. How might a potentially revitalized US-EU relationship help the EU to address many of these festering tensions and conflicts? Over to you.
That's a great question, Fahad. I think in all of these, Turkey plays an enormously important role for the European Union. Turkey, of course, has been sending exploration ships, for drilling of gas and oil throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, irking Greece and Cyprus, by moving in waters of the exclusive economic zone, thereby threatening in a way the sovereignty of an EU member state. And the response has been slow coming on the European side. It is helpful, I think, for the European Union that Congress has now forced Trump's hand in imposing sanctions on Erdogan's decision to buy S-400 missiles from Russia. I think it will be equally important for the European Union to find an ally that is willing to put more pressure on Ankara as far as its role in the conflict in Libya is concerned, as well as Syria, indeed. So, I mean, on many of these aspects, the main strategic rival, in a way, even if a NATO ally, to 22 of the European Union's member states that are also affiliated to NATO, I think that strategic rivalry between the EU and Erdogan's Turkey, I should say, could really use a boost, and is likely to receive a boost from closer transatlantic cooperation on this particular front. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, and others have called for curbs on arms exports to Turkey. They've called for discussion on Turkey's role in the Eastern Mediterranean, Southern Mediterranean, in the context of NATO. So there's a lot more emphasis that will go, at least that's the expectation in Brussels, that will go to that particular region.
Thank you. So given that the US, like the EU, will likely have to focus on domestic affairs, i.e. COVID-19, and that the US may continue its America First policy even into the Biden administration, how does the EU plan to strengthen its own strategic autonomy? To go a little further, you have written about the need for Europe to harden its soft power into, quote, lawfare. What does that mean? Over to you.
Well, strategic autonomy has become, a buzz phrase in Brussels in 2020. It was used, of course, prior to the COVID-19 year, but it's really gotten a lot of emphasis, not so much in relations to the US, even though claims that European partners should spend up to 2% of their annual GDP on defense has been noted years ago, and has in fact triggered at the supranational level within Europe, initiatives whereby a common defense market would be generated through concrete projects, whereby basically new military and defense platforms would be built between coalitions of member states, but within an EU regulatory and financial framework. In fact, today, a political agreement was reached between the German rotating presidency of the EU and the European Parliament on an €8 billion package under the European Defence Fund, which should stimulate basically the defence build-up of Europe as a whole. And so, I mean, this is the traditional interpretation, of course, of building up strategic autonomy for the European Union. But knowing that many, all in keeping, in full complementarity with NATO, I should add, but knowing that many of the more soft power dossiers, telecoms, transport, chemicals, have rare earths. The fact that a lot of these topics have risen to prominence to the high political sphere as a result of China's inroads into Europe, literally through investments, in the Belt and Road project, snatching up, key strategic industries and companies throughout Europe. And these topics, which naturally fall within, the sphere of the creation of a single market, economic market for the European Union, have been regulated for many decades by the European Union, have lifted in a way the geopolitical nature of the EU, which was otherwise, of course, always known to be a peace project, and certainly not a state that could back up its words with military force if need be. So, but this recalibration basically across the board, from the incipient, formation of a European Defence Union, which may take years to materialize, but the elevation of more traditional geoeconomic policy areas at supranational level has really gotten a boost this time around with the shaping around an industrial strategy for Europe, primarily, of course, in the face of China's inroads. At the same time, the knowledge that the European Union, which has, with its member states, so many commercial interests with China that it would not like to forfeit straight away, for the blue eyes of Mr. Biden, and his appeal, even with bipartisan backing for a much stricter China policy, have made Europe realize that it needs to take a more nimble, position in between, not at equidistance between China, which is of course a systemic rival because of its communist-led capitalist system, but with much closer to that of the US, with which most of Europe shares a constitutional DNA and value base. Nevertheless, that idea of shoring up all aspects to the international positioning of the European Union has become much more front and center in strategic thinking at EU level, which frankly is probably the first time that it's really materialized. Now, in that context, it's almost untapped pool resource of power that lies within the law. And lawfare, you asked for this, is of course a concept that was coined in the US, the defense circles already in the beginning of the 2000s, which means that you've effectively deployed financial, insurance, and energy law to boost America's power and check that of its adversaries. And as I mentioned before, I mean, transatlantic allies in Europe have been the first, to feel the stick when European companies were forced to stop trading with Iran, or risk indeed, the ire of the Treasury Department. So despite evidence that certain countries around the world have been waging a shadow war against the EU for years, from Russia's 2007 cyber attack on Estonia to Turkey's drilling activities in the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus, and we talked about that. Of course, China's wolf warrior diplomacy in European capitals. Rivals have been chipping away at Europe's strategic autonomy. So it seems like, for the European Union, which was famously described by a German foreign minister as a vegetarian in a world full of carnivores, the lack of a systematic engagement with lawfare seems like a missed opportunity. As a community of law, the EU has in fact had a long history of doing legal battle to defend its autonomy and promote its norms in the international arena. So, rather than worry about the impact of retaliation on its economy, I think the EU should broaden its global strategy and use the law much more adroitly to defend its interests and advance its security objectives in the world. And so, if the risk of conflict is indeed greater in a post-corona world, and if some portion of future warfare can be shifted to the legal arena, I think that should be to the EU's tactical advantage, and that is why I floated this idea that the EU look much more closely to the opportunities that could be that lie within this sphere of EU lawfare.
Thank you, Steven. So that brings me to my final question. One of the current drivers of U.S. Department of Defense policy is so-called great power competition. That's one of the buzzwords in Washington, D.C. at the moment. At the same time, the new NATO 2030 report, as well as internal EU discussions, propose solutions on how to stay relevant in the face of new challenges from Russia and China amidst perceptions of a U.S. retreat from Europe. So where do you see all of this going, especially in light of Biden's electoral victory? Over to you.
Yes, well, great power competition is, of course, not something that the EU wishes, the world to move into. It's clear that there is G2 rivalry, but if it's up to the European Union and its member states, it will try, and balance that in favor of multilateralism. And so here, I think, the strategic alliance that existed in the transatlantic sphere has in fact ended and will be reinvented. And it will be reinvented, as far as Europeans are concerned, on a much more nimble basis. And vis-a-vis China, in fact, the European Union has already done so. In March 2019, the European Commission and the High Representative floated a paper in which they simultaneously characterized China as an economic, a partner on multilateral issues, but also an economic competitor and a systemic rival. And so, whereas there is no firm strategy as to how to deal with China, the EU is keeping its hands free in trying to separate dossiers in their dealings with China, and I suppose in defense of its own interests, in defense of its own security objectives as well. And I assume that is going to drive Europe's strategic posture to the world, even if it moves into a great power competition, and even if there is renewed calls from DC about decoupling from China. There might be some willingness to move up closer to more stringent approach with China, but this will not go at the expense of commercial interests, which are greatest in the greatest member state of the European Union. China is Germany's first export market for cars and for many other products. So this is unlikely to move the needle a lot on EU policy versus China. So in that context, I think the European interests will be served mostly where they can connect with the Biden administration's plea for a remodernization of multilateralism, one that will not be defined along Chinese characteristics, but that is firmly anchored in the Atlantic.
Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to join the interview series. I know that our audience will greatly appreciate all of your very candid insights. Hopefully we can meet again in person in the near future. And to everyone watching from home, as always, we wish you happiness, safety, good health, and a great holiday season to those celebrating. This will likely be the last installment of the series for 2020, so we will see you all next year. Goodbye.